Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and this evening we're going to talk a little bit about an ancient art, calligraphy, and we have with us a lady who found it, Maryanne Grebenstein. Welcome, Maryanne.
Thank you, George. Thank you for inviting me.
So you got your own shop. You've got the picture of it up here. It's over in Marblehead. How long have you been in that?
I've had the shop for about 7 years, but I've had the business longer than that. I was on the South Shore prior to opening the shop in Hingham, and I had just a studio, no shop.
Yeah.
But I've had the business for about 30 years.
Yeah.
So
when you say you've got a business, what kind of products do you produce?
So I'm a calligrapher, so all of my work is done by hand, and I create corporate recognition awards for various retirement of a member of the board or some such thing, beneficiary, if someone gives money to a hospital, say, or a museum, and they want to recognize the donation, I create a document to acknowledge that. I make handmade books, completely hand-lettered, hand-bound for special occasions, one-of-a-kind books. I do, of course, wedding invitations and envelopes, and special gifts. People come to me for special wedding gifts, anniversary gifts, memorials. Anytime that there's a special text that is meaningful to someone, they bring it to me, and I create a document that is a keepsake for them.
Yeah. So these documents, you mentioned they're all hand-lettered, hand-created. What kind of tools do you use? Because I remember years ago, I was living in Chicago, and we used to go into it used to be the Oriental section of town, and they used to have these little Japanese sets where they do everything with a brush and grind your own ink.
Yeah. So I don't use a brush.
No.
Asian calligraphy, you use a brush. I use a pen, which is usually a metal nib, a metal tip to the pen that I dip in ink. I don't use a fountain pen. And I do occasionally still grind stick ink. That is still a thing. We do that, not for every project, but occasionally. So usually a metal nib, occasionally a quill. I still, cut a feather to use as a quill, and ink, of course. The paper is usually a nice quality, smooth surface or hot press art paper, watercolor paper, but occasionally vellum, which is what would have been used in the medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. Vellum is actually animal skin. The word vellum actually has a lot of uses in the art world, but the vellum I'm referring to is usually calf skin vellum. It's the skin of the animal that is treated and stretched very, very thin, and it's the surface is prepared so it's very smooth to write on. And most of these older books that you would see from the 13th, 14th, 15th century would have been created on vellum. So ink, vellum or paper. Pens, of course. The color that I use is gouache. It's not colored ink. It comes in a tube. It's an opaque gouache or opaque watercolor that I mix with water to get it to a thin enough consistency that I can use it in the pen. And then gold or silver. So sometimes gold paint, a metallic gold paint, but sometimes for a very special document, I will actually use gold leaf, which is 23.75 carat. It's almost pure gold. Pure gold is 24 carat. And it's a sort of a painstaking process to get it to adhere to the paper, and it's sort of raised up on the paper so it has a little bit of a dimension, and it catches the light beautifully because of the fact that it's raised up off of the paper.
Well, when you do one of these raised letters, do you have to sort of build up underneath it with, what do you use?
Gesso, really good question. Because, of course, the gold wouldn't stick to the paper or to the vellum. You have to have a medium to make it stick. So there are a couple different things that you can use, but I use gesso. I just use acrylic gesso, but you can make or buy medieval gesso. It's the same thing that was used,
Yeah.
hundreds of years ago. But it contains white lead, so I don't want to play with that. So I use acrylic gesso. But it dries. It's a liquid, a thick liquid, and it dries to almost like it almost feels like plaster of Paris once it's dry. But I have to do multiple coats. Takes a couple of days because you need to let it dry overnight between coats and so forth. But yeah, it builds up. And that gesso raises it up off of the page.
So you get a texture to it.
Right.
Other than the rest of his flat ink.
Right.
On
Exactly.
paper or on vellum.
Yeah.
And then you got this raised capital letter usually.
Right.
In it.
Right.
Do you ever do an illustrated book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I have. But I used mostly my illustrations are sort of a medieval nature. Bestiaries and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, because I always remember they talk about these ancient Bibles or ancient textbooks that somebody's made, and they're all illustrated. And they have a big letter.
Right.
It's
Right.
almost an artwork piece in itself.
Yeah, it is. And actually, they're known as illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah.
And that's what the word illuminated actually refers to, the gold that's used in it.
Okay.
And it's sort of an interesting word because these documents, of course, were made before the electric light existed.
Oh, yeah.
And so the candlelight that would catch and reflect on the gold would actually illuminate the page. So it wasn't just the idea of the letter being illuminated because it contains gold, but it would actually facilitate the reading because it would shed light on the text.
Yeah.
So it was not only a beautiful decoration, it actually had a purpose. So yeah, pretty interesting.
You almost have to be a monk to do this.
Yeah, so true.
I'm always thinking back to the pictures you see of some monk hunched way over the picture, working forever, making a copy of the Bible or something.
Right. And heaven forbid you make a mistake because there's no correcting for the most part on these things. So occasionally you can. Actually, vellum, surprisingly enough, the vellum is more forgiving if you do have to make a correction because you can use a razor blade to scrape off your lettering, whereas the paper, oftentimes you're starting over. There's really no way to correct on paper.
Yeah, because the ink will settle into the paper.
Exactly.
Whereas it just lays on the surface of the vellum.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah.
Working on vellum is almost like working on plastic.
In some ways it is, yeah. It's an interesting substance too because it does, unlike plastic, it reacts to its environment. So if it's in a very humid environment, it will curl up, and it's strong too. Like if you try to, you try to like keep it flat, like stretched on a board, while you're working on it. And if it's a very humid day, that tape won't even hold it. It just pulls right out and curls up and has a life of its own.
It becomes a rolled up.
Yeah, right. So, but it is interesting because the tools and materials that I use every day are really pretty much the same as the ones that have been used for hundreds of years. So, hasn't changed much at all.
Yeah, as we were kidding before the discussion, that they took hundreds of years to develop the process to get it to where it was back then.
Right.
And there ain't much room for improvement.
No.
And maybe AI will come along and come up with something, but...
Well, the printing press, I joke that they've been trying to kill us off for about 500 years, ever since the beginning of the printing press, but we're still here. Not too many of us, but we're still around.
Well, that gets to be a different kind of document.
Yeah, of course.
Way back when, the only source of books was hand-lettered books that were, as they say, meticulously copied page by page. And took a whole flock of monks sitting in a dark room copying these things to produce a copy of the book.
Absolutely.
And along came Gutenberg, and well, actually, the Chinese invented it before Gutenberg, but...
for our Western society, Gutenberg.
He came up with the movable type and just totally changed Europe. So it was a major breakthrough for lots of reasons.
Absolutely, yeah.
And but getting back to your business of doing it by hand, now it becomes a special document more than just it was time-consuming and labor-intensive. It's usually something that celebrates something
It
different.
does, yeah, absolutely. And it's created for a specific person or a specific event, and that makes it very special too, because it's a one of a kind, you know.
Well, in your collection of pictures that keep flashing up here, it looks like these things take quite a bit of time.
They do.
So if I wanted one of these documents for a wedding, how much lead time do I have to think about?
I mean, it varies depending on the document, obviously, but
Yeah.
certainly, 3 to 4 weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
And same with the invitations, to hand letter, not only the design, but the actual envelopes and so forth. Yeah, you need a number of weeks to get those together and out the door in a timely way. Yeah, yeah. So I'm usually working on projects. Most of the time, it's a couple months in advance, but
Yeah.
it depends on the project
Well,
and
how
the people.
detailed it is and how many
Right,
copies
right,
you
right,
need, yeah.
Right.
If
right.
it's just a one-of-a-kind document to celebrate, like you said, the retirement of some board member,
Right.
that I would assume is a couple-of-week project.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
But if you-
Particularly if it's gold and so forth, yeah.
Yeah. But if it's going to be wedding invitations for a flock of 40 people or something like that, that's months of work.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be, absolutely. Depending on, in the case of an invitation, if it's a large quantity, which normally it is for a wedding invitation, I would have reproductions of my hand lettering done. I wouldn't necessarily do each invitation individually.
Okay.
But occasionally, I'm actually working on a job right now that's very small celebration, and there are only 5 invitations that are going out, so they'll all be done by hand.
Yeah.
And the envelopes, of course, are always all done by hand.
Yeah, because every address is different.
Exactly,
You can't
yeah.
reproduce them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a picture of you working there.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a Quaker marriage certificate, and it's a very interesting tradition that a lot of non-Quakers have adopted over the years. It's you can see the heading there, the names of the bride and the groom, and there was gold leaf used on that one, and they were of Celtic Irish heritage, so we used the Celtic style, and it contains the name and a name of the bride and the groom, the city and the state where they were married, and a paragraph, not their vows exactly, but something close to their vows.
Yeah.
And then each person who attends the wedding signs this document as a show of support and commitment that they make to the marriage. So it's a very, very meaningful tradition and document for the bride and groom to keep.
Yeah. Years ago, I went to Turkey, Ankara, and we were just hanging around, and some guy says, I'll give you a tour of the museum for, I don't know, turns out to be about $1.25, but it was a gazillion lira at the time. And their technique for recording a wedding was a vase
Oh, lovely.
sitting about this high, and spiraling around the outside were pictures of people drawn into it, all the way up to the top.
Wow.
And we had walked through the museum before and said, yeah, that's interesting. What was that? But once you get somebody who knows what they're talking about and takes you through and explains what it is, oh, yeah, so that was equivalent to the group photo.
Yeah, right.
But it was wrapped around.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, so-
great. I love that.
So that whole idea of people there to reinforce the commitment and say, hey, we all witnessed this. It's a done deal. I think it goes way back.
Yeah, it's a really, really nice tradition,
So you mentioned you did this in a Celtic style. How many different styles can you do, or do you do?
Oh, so good question. There are kind of 2 categories of calligraphy. One is what we call broad edge lettering. So that would be the type that's made with the chisel-shaped nib. That's the
Square tip.
metal. Yep. And those lettering styles, there are about 5 basic lettering styles, but of course, literally probably millions of variations from them, but 5 sort of basic starters. And they all date to before the printing press. So it would be uncial, which is the Celtic style. That was the style of lettering that was used in the Book of Kells. So it's very much associated with the Celtic culture. Gothic, which is also known as black letter or Old English. that was sort of German ilk. Italic, Carolingian, which is a very old style of lettering where there's actually not even a capital letter in this style because it sort of predated what we think of as a capital letter or a lowercase letter. It was a whole different technique. You mentioned seeing Bibles and other documents that had like a big illuminated capital letter to start the book. But as you read further into it, you'll see smaller, still large, but smaller decorated letters. And those were to tell the reader this is a new thought or a new sentence. There was no punctuation. And this was a visual clue to the reader that this is a new sentence or a new chapter or whatever it might be. Depending on the size of the letter, that tells you, is it a new sentence, new chapter, new verse, whatever. So Carolingian didn't even have an uppercase set of letters to it because these decorated letters would be used. So there are those 5 that are the oldest styles. And then the printing press came along and almost killed calligraphy and hand lettering, but not quite. And then in, I'm not sure the exact date, but I think like maybe the late 1700s or early 1800s, there was a need for a business hand, a way for recording business and legal documents. And so a new style of lettering evolved, and it was the script, which is what our handwriting evolved from. But it was a totally different kind of pen. It's still a metal tip, but it's pointed instead of having that square. And so the script, as we all know, is very, very methodical, very flowery, flourishy, lots of curves, and all the letters are connected, and they have a slope. So long answer to your question. So they're basically like 6 styles, 5 broad-edged, and then copperplate script is what we call the script that we make today.
Yeah. Again, dating myself, in high school I took drafting, and in college had to take drafting because I'm an engineer by trade. And everything was done by hand back then. No such thing as a CAD/CAM program.
Right.
It was T-square and...
I use a T-square every single day.
and triangle and maybe a compass once in a while.
Yeah.
But all the lettering had to be one-stroke Gothic, which is sort of like script, but it's not connected. And had to learn how to do that.
Yeah, a different way to do your writing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And since my writing is written rotten, I think I do most of my stuff as printing these days.
Yeah.
At least so I can read it.
Yeah. Everybody's handwriting is worse than it was, partly because of the computer. We don't write things by hand the way we used to.
And the other one, the quip that goes around is the script writing like you're showing here.
Yeah, that would be done. That's the copperplate script. Yeah.
That is referred to as the code of the elders. Nobody else can read it except us old guys.
Yeah.
So a lot of this goes around, and like you say, there's a lot of opportunities for people to specialize in occasion with a document. And this keeps coming down, even with the computers. You want to document something, and it's something you can hold in your hand.
Right.
And having a cell phone in your pocket, or a chip, or a thumb drive, that doesn't quite
doesn't pack the punch, right?
No. And whereas you pick up a piece of paper and says, yeah, I can read that, and that's what it says here, and I got a signature at the bottom or something.
Right.
So,
it's very meaningful.
Yeah, so it still comes down to the point of we have to put something on a piece of paper, and or vellum, to really say that it really happened. It's documented.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And these things get passed down to generations oftentimes, you know, and they become more valuable over time.
Well, that gets another question. You produce one of these documents, and it's very fancy. How do you protect it?
So, good question. Most of my pieces are framed. I work closely with a custom framer down the street from my shop. oftentimes we'll put ultraviolet glass on the frame to keep on the piece to keep it from fading. But honestly, the materials that I use are very, very light fast. The gouache and the inks are, they will last hundreds of years, literally. But that's one of the reasons why we use gouache and not a colored ink, because colored inks do not have that light fastness, and they will fade in a very short time. So it depends a lot on the materials that you're using. And also, if it's in a book, gets very little exposure to the sunlight most of the time, so that's kind of a natural protection. Yeah, I mean, you have to be careful. I'm sure you've been in museums where documents are in a room where the lights are very dim, or you know, they're only shown occasionally, like the Book of Kells. You know, it's very ceremonial when they turn the pages, and they, you know, they have a very rigid routine of when they turn the pages because they don't want too much exposure and so forth. So you do have to be mindful of that, but they're hardier than you might expect them to be.
Yeah. Well, you talk about making these ceremonial books or special books, like I guess you did one on the Raven and a few others. Where do you bind them? Do you do the binding too, or is it just...
Another good question. I am not a bookbinder. I have dabbled a little bit in bookbinding, but I do work with bookbinders. They are around, and so I create the manuscript and I take it to a bookbinder, and they do the binding for me, and they do beautiful, beautiful work. We oftentimes will have use a leather covering on the boards, or handmade marbled paper with leather spine and corners.
What's that again?
Handmade marbled paper. It's well, it's a decorative paper. You've probably seen it. Maybe didn't know it was called marbled paper, but you know, all the swirls and the beautiful, vibrant colors. It was actually created originally for bookbinding purposes. It's made on a heavy paper stock, so it's very durable. And that would cover like the main part of the boards for the book, but the spine and the corners that get the wear, they would oftentimes be covered in leather because that's a little bit more durable. So the bookbinder and I usually work out what colors should be used and what binding design should be used. But it's pretty, that in and of itself is a pretty fascinating topic, just the way the book goes together, because you have different sections, just like think of a newspaper, like an actual paper newspaper, and the sections, you know, the front section, Metro, the sports, whatever, and they're stacked, you know, the papers folded and stacked. And the same technique for bookmaking, you have these different sections, and then the sections are sewn together, and then the binding is attached to the manuscript. So I make the manuscript, and then the binder creates the binding.
Well, most of the books that I see, it's you end up with a couple of pages folded together, and then the sewing goes down in between. Is that how you make yours the same way?
Yep.
So they're made to be folded.
Right.
Okay.
So again, this brings up. So it, you know, it's like a newspaper. If you've ever taken one single piece of the newspaper out of a section, you know that the numbers of the pages are not necessarily in sequence because of the way they're folded and so forth. So that's all has to go into the planning of making the manuscript, is making sure that you understand like which page is going to go where, so that you get the text in the proper order and so forth. So it's a little bit complicated. It's kind of fun, but it's a little bit complicated.
So it's not like just printing out a series of pages and stapling them in the corner.
No. And an interesting thing about these medieval manuscripts that we were talking about a minute ago, they of course were made the same way, multiple sections that were sewn together. But oftentimes the bookbinders were illiterate and would not actually be able to read the text that they were binding. And so there was a technique that they developed so that they could make sure the bookbinder would get these sections in the proper order so that the book read as it was supposed to, and the term was called a catchword. So what they would do, if they have, you know, this is your paper in your book, in your manuscript. So you come to the last page of that particular section, and then the next section begins. So whatever the first word is on that next section, you put that down at the bottom of this page. The scribes would put it, and that was the clue. So the bookbinder could match up the two words and know that he had the sections in the proper order. So.
Yeah, that gets to be another interesting problem. A lot of these people doing the work, like you say, were illiterate. They couldn't read it. It's like me trying to understand Chinese or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And no clue as to what it is.
Right. right, right.
So the coordination gets to be a little challenging. Yeah.
Somebody has to be overseeing the whole operation to make sure it gets done
Yeah.
properly, of course, yeah.
So Benjamin Franklin did some good work
Yeah.
after all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you got a shop in Marblehead.
I do.
You take commissions, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talked, it's a long lead process. You don't walk in today and say, I want it tomorrow.
Right.
And you might get a laugh out of that, but that's about as far as it goes.
Yeah.
So
So I have a shop in Marblehead. I'm at 84 Washington Street in Old Town. Anybody who would like to stop by and see samples or come and talk about a project, I would be delighted to welcome you at the shop.
yeah, so you're in business, and you have been in business for Marblehead for, was it
About 7 years in
7
Marblehead.
years in Marblehead, so you're well established and well known there, I assume.
I hope.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening. And as I usually mentioned, my email is after the credits. If you've got any comments or questions, feel free to send me a note. Or if you've got a longer discussion you want to have, make room for you here at the table. And thanks again for watching.